On the last episode of the Keepsake box. "Go get the blanket," he said. I went into my closet and retrieved the blanket that I used for Ken's visits. I returned to the bathroom. Before allotting me the opportunity to extend the blanket, Ken pushed me onto the floor. He pulled my nightgown up and pulled off my underwear. I tried to object. I was bone dry, just as I had been when Ron tried to force his finger inside. But unlike Ron, Ken didn't give up. He kept trying to force his way in, to no avail. After a few minutes, he told me to get onto my knees. I did as I was told. That was the first time that I participated in oral sex. Prior to that moment, the thought of oral sex hadn't ever crossed my mind. It was forceful. Ken grabbed the back of my head and pushed his penis in and out of my mouth. I've previously mentioned how well endowed Ken was. Oral sex with him was as uncomfortable as penetration. My temples were hurting, and I developed an awful headache. It was extremely uncomfortable. Ken stopped, and I was relieved. I thought it was over. But before I could get up, Ken walked around and pushed my shoulders down. Instinctively, I extended my arms, causing my elbows to hit the bathroom floor. It was painful, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to alert Mama Ron. I guess my saliva provided enough moisture for Ken to enter. He pushed his way in from behind. Even though I was slightly moist, it was still extremely painful. He pumped hard and fast. He didn't consider my comfort, as he had on every other occasion. And just as Ken was about to climax, he pulled out of me and ejaculated onto my backside. I felt the warmth of his semen trickle down. Passing my anus, a large portion of it fell into the floor. Ken stood and wiped his penis with the robe that hung on my bathroom door. He discarded it on the floor and pulled his pants up. Without speaking a word, he and I both walked out of the bathroom. Chapter 18, Box of Promises. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. It was Wednesday, but it wasn't met with the usual excitement. I didn't know what to expect from the upcoming interaction with Ken. I walked to the bus stop as I did every other morning. Surprisingly, Ken was already there, awaiting my arrival. I got into the car and threw my book bag into the back seat. I took a brief moment to look at Ken. He smiled sweetly and said, "Hey, baby." Hey, baby. After the events of the night prior, all he managed to say was, "Hey, baby." I had spent the whole night thinking about what I would say to Ken. Yet in that moment, my lips simply said, "Hey." We rode in silence all the way to Ron's place in the woods. I gathered my usual materials and started walking down the path towards the shack. I didn't wait for Ken as I usually did. I unlocked the door and took my normal position on the couch. Ken joined me moments later and completed the usual setup. He put a bag on the door and retrieved 2 bottles of water. He passed me a bottle and took one for himself, and by that time, I had worked up the nerve to address him. I told Ken that we needed to talk, and he agreed. Well, that was unexpected. I assumed that I would dictate the direction of the conversation, but he started talking right away. Ken walked over to where I sat on the couch. He got onto his knees and positioned himself between my legs. Ken was much taller than I was, and although I was sitting, we were nearly at eye level. We momentarily sat in silence. Ken placed his hand onto my cheek, and without thinking, I instinctively placed my hand on top of his. I wanted to be firm and show him that I was upset, but I couldn't. I knew in that moment that I would stay with him regardless of what he said. Ken started by apologizing and telling me that I was the most important person in his life. He didn't know it, but I was already sold on his apology. Nonetheless, I allowed him to continue. Ken started crying, just as he had when I found out about Melanie. He told me that he was going through a lot at home, and he was sorry to have taken it out on me. I completely disregarded what Ken had done to me in lieu of hearing what he was going through. I asked Ken to get off of the floor. I felt that he was demeaning himself by being on his knees, as if he hadn't forced me onto my knees just hours earlier. Ken sat beside me and held my hand. He told me that both of his parents had been arrested in a drug bust a few weeks prior, and he recently found out that things weren't looking good for them. I asked Ken why he hadn't told me what he was going through, and he said that he wanted me to concentrate on school instead of worrying about his situation, as he knew I would. "Where are you going to live?" I asked. He told me that his parents had left enough money to make sure that the bills would be taken care of in their absence. Ken was technically an adult, but I couldn't imagine him living alone. He told me that he had been taking care of himself for a long time, even prior to his parents going to jail. While I hadn't been orphaned, I had been taking care of myself as well, so I felt like we were connected on that point. According to Ken, he was stressed out. Consequently, he'd had too much to drink and smoke some marijuana, and that made sense in my mind. I didn't know what marijuana smelled like, but I was very much aware that Ken smelled different the night before. His explanation gave me what I needed, a valid reason to stay with him. The person from the night prior wasn't my Ken. He was alternate Ken. Alternate Ken was the mean Ken that was affected by pain, drugs, and alcohol, but not my Ken. My Ken wouldn't ever hurt me. The answer was simple. All I had to do was keep him happy and sober. Right? Ken sweetened the pot by capitalizing on something that he knew would pull at my heartstrings. He started quoting, "Where do broken hearts go? And if somebody loves you, won't they always love you? I look in your eyes, and I know that you still care for me." "Do you still care for me, Londa?" That's what Ken asked me. "You know I do," I said, and he knew that I did. I told Ken that I understood what he was going through, but he had to understand how hurt I was by what he had done. "I know," he said. Ken turned to face me. He had tears in his eyes. "Baby, if you give me one more chance, I promise to never hurt you again." I often replay Ken's voice saying that to me, not because it was such an important moment, but because I've heard it so many times since then. "I'll never hurt you again." Realistically, no one can legitimately promise not to ever hurt someone else. Pain isn't universal. There are so many ways to hurt a person. How can one promise not to ever venture into hurtful territory? That's just not realistic. But that's a tool of the enemy, as Grandma would say. They say whatever needs to be said when they're confronted with their own behavior. I've learned that they will express things in a positive way or a negative way, depending on what fits their objective. In that case, it was positive. Ken appealed to my need to be loved. He told me how special I was and how much he needed me. It worked in his favor because I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be needed. And truthfully, I thought I needed him too. I didn't think I could ever find another Ken. He told me that he knew he didn't deserve it, but he was begging for me to forgive him. And I don't have to tell you that I did. I expected Ken to initiate sex once he realized that I had forgiven him, but he didn't. He took the time to attempt to fix what he had broken. Instead of eating our regular snacks, Ken picked up breakfast from a local fast food restaurant. He spent the day catering to me and making me feel special. We cuddled on the couch and he told me how much he loved me. That day passed much too quickly. Before I knew it, it was time for Ken to take me back to the bus stop. We cleaned the shack and made our way back to the car. As our first Wednesday of the school year came to an end, I thought about how lucky I was to have him. "Wait," said Ken, "I have something for you." In my eyes, the day had been perfect. What more could there have been? Ken opened his trunk and retrieved a Polaroid camera. "Let's take a picture," he said. I was ecstatic. We took a few pictures and Ken divided them between us. He reached into the trunk again. That time, he retrieved a box. "What's this?" I asked. "It's a keepsake box," he said. "You can keep special things inside." I could not have known the extreme role that the keepsake box would play in my life. I opened the box and there was a smaller box inside. Upon opening that box, I found that there was a ring inside. Ken took the ring from the box and slid it onto my right ring finger. He told me that it was a promise ring. In my experience, a promise ring was a promise to stay pure. Ken and I had broken that promise long before then. He explained that it was a symbol of his promise to me. Ken told me that he promised to love and protect me for as long as he was alive. He told me that the ring connected us forever. I accepted that ring with tears in my eyes. No one had ever made me feel that way. I promised to love and protect him forever and to always be his. Another thing that would play an extreme role in our lives. As crazy as it seems, that moment imprinted him on my heart, and that promise followed me forever. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon. I sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.